Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for today's program. My name is Melissa Laureano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic and built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helped underwrite public programs like this one today. They are Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So as part of our 50th anniversary celebration this year, August programming is specifically dedicated to highlighting the rich histories and cultural resources of Wards 7 and 8. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Karen Gordon of Seattle, Washington for sponsoring this month in memory of her dear friend, Patricia E. Williams. Pat was a founding member of her organization and a native of Southeast Washington. She devoted her career and volunteer activities to preserve and protect the urban environment in her native Washington, D.C., and in Mount Rainier, Maryland, where she resided for much of her adult life. This program is also presented in collaboration with the DC History Center. So we thank them for their partnership, and I will pass the microphone to Executive Director Laura Brauer Haygood to tell us a little bit more about the DC History Center.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa, for inviting me to welcome everyone for this afternoon's event. We are just so thrilled to have everyone with us. I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to the DC Preservation League for bringing us on to partner on this event. And we are happy to be joined today by a truly amazing, knowledgeable, thoughtful, and forward-thinking group of panelists to talk not only about the history of Berry Farm and Hillsdale, but about what preserving the past means and what comes next. So for those of you who aren't already familiar with us, a few words of introduction. The Historical Society of Washington, D.C., which is now doing business as the DC History Center, is a nonprofit, community-supported educational and research organization founded in 1894, 127 years ago, and located at the Carnegie Library at Mount Vernon Square. Through research, scholarship, youth education, and adult programs, exhibits as well, we deepen understanding of our city's past to connect, empower, and inspire. We do take great pride in showcasing the most recent research on DC history, not only through panels like today's, but also through our Washington History Magazine and the annual DC History Conference. So to sign up for our email newsletter, please do visit us at dchistory.org. I should also mention that we have Ms. Amos's book, Berry Farm's Hillsdale and Anacostia, a historic African-American community, available for purchase on our online shop at dchistory.org. So if you visit our website, pick up a copy of her book as well. So thank you again to the DC Preservation League for their effort in organizing and planning this wonderful panel. And now back to Melissa, who will take us from here.
Well, thank you so much for those thoughtful remarks, and thank you for sharing a link to the book in the chat, Maren. So just as a couple of notes, so please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions of our presenters. We're going to collect all of your questions and verbally ask some of our speakers at the conclusions of their presentation. So for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, DCPL's Community Outreach and Grants Manager, Zachary Burt, will be monitoring any questions that you all might have and will pass those along to us as well. So please feel free to ask questions. All right, so with that, I just want to thank our panelists again for taking the time to speak to us today. And I'm so pleased to introduce you all to today's moderator. So Sarah Jane Schoenfeld is an independent scholar and public historian specializing in DC history. Her work addresses DC's racialized housing landscape and planning regime, the intersection of race and historic preservation, and the history of organizing around civil rights and Black governance in DC. For her company, Prologue DC, Sarah engages in a variety of public history projects, including research for exhibitions and films, historic landmark and district nominations, oral histories, and walking tours. So Prologue DC actually authored the Berry Farm Dwellings Historic Landmark nomination with Empower DC and the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association. Sarah is a co-founder of the Digital Public History Project, Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC, which is documenting the former extent of racially restricted housing in the nation's capital. So with that, I will turn things over to Sarah.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks so much. It's great to see so many people here today. I see a lot of participants. So thanks so much for everybody tuning in the middle of the day. And I'm really excited to be here with this group of panelists all of whom I've worked very closely with over the past couple of years on recording the history of Berry Farm, Hillsdale, and putting together a successful landmark nomination. So I may have some remarks as we go along, given that I've been pretty intimately involved with this process myself. But I will try to keep those to a minimum so that you all have time to ask your own questions. So I'm going to begin by introducing our first panelist, Alcione Amos. She is currently a museum curator at the Smithsonian Institution Anacostia Community Museum. She's originally from Brazil and has lived and worked in the United States for 5 decades. She worked as a researcher and librarian at the World Bank for more than 20 years, while at the same time maintaining a career as an independent scholar. Her fields of interest include post-slavery societies, such as those of the Black Seminoles and African Americans in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War, and Afro-Brazilians who moved to West Africa in the 19th century. Alcione has also studied the Gullah communities of coastal Georgia and South Carolina. Alcione Amos has published in Africa, Brazil, the United States, and Europe. She holds a Master's of Library Science degree from Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And her latest book, published in January of this year, is called Berry Farm, Hillsdale, and Anacostia, a historic African-American community. And I think we have a link for that. We'll be putting a link in the chat for where that's available. It's now available from the DC History Center's shop. And I want to say that Alcione's research for this book was really integral to the historic landmark nomination that we compiled. She very generously shared with me the research she had been done for the book before it was published. So shared the research files so that we could put this thing together. And I really am grateful for that. So now I will turn over to Alcione. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. And I was very glad to be able to make my files available for the nomination. So, you know, that made me very happy. But anyway, first next slide, please. First, I should explain the hyphenated name, which might create a little bit of confusion, but there is a reason for it. The early settlers were not happy with the name Berry Farm because the Berry family, which had owned the land where the settlement was created, owned enslaved people. First, they proposed the name Hillsborough, but that was not accepted. Then it was suggested Potomac City, and that for a while appeared in the maps. Then the name Hillsdale was officially approved, but it never appeared in the maps. And if today you buy a house on the footprint of the original settlement, your deed will say Berry Farm. So after examining this complex name history, we decided to hyphenate the name. So it's a compromise because we thought that retaining Berry Farm, the historic name, was necessary. Next. After the Civil War, housing was a big problem for the newly arrived African Americans in Washington, D.C. This photo shows the temporary housing that the new arrivals built from discarded materials and their precarious living conditions. Next. According to General Howard, the superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau, he went to visit one such temporary settlement in downtown Washington on K Street, no less K Street, where all the lawyers reside today. General Howard was well aware of the situation, visited the site because the landowners was requesting the land back. When he arrived there, he got all the men together, of course. The women did not have a say. And he told them they had to leave because that was private property. The response was, where shall we go? What shall we do? And that's when Howard presented the question, what would make you self-supporting? And received the answer, land, give us land. We must remember that the majority of the African-American refugees were rural people who knew how to cultivate the land and making a living out of it. According to Howard, that gave him the idea to buy farmland as close to Washington, D.C. as possible, divide it into lots, sell lumber to build a small house, and provide them with the chance for a new start. Thus, the concept of Berry Farm was born. Next. This is a map from 1867, which shows the settlement. 375 acres of land divided into 359 lots, occupying 9 sections. And by October 1, 1868, 300 lots had already been sold. It was quite a successful enterprise. Next. This is receipt number 1, the receipt of the first buyer, Reverend Richard A. Hall's down payment on June 27, 1867. The new settlers had to pay for everything, the land and the materials to build a small 2-room home. You might think such a small home, but remember that these people had been enslaved, and to own property and to be able to build their own home was indeed a significant achievement. Next. This is the house built by William Fractions on Elvins Road. This was the typical A-frame Berry Farm house built during the first phase of the settlement. Incidentally, A-frame refers to the format of the roof, sloping on both sides of the house. William Fractions was a carpenter by trade, so we believe he built the house with his own hands. The main house is to your left. To the right is an addition that was put in the 1940s when water and sanitation were brought into the neighborhood. He added a bathroom and a new bedroom to the structure. You heard right, 1940, when water and sanitation was brought into the neighborhood. This photograph was taken in 2009. The house was hazed shortly after this picture was taken. This might have been the last sample of an A-type frame house in Berry Farm, Hillsdale. I have driven all around the neighborhood and I have not been able to find anything else. So this was the last one. The Fractions family had occupied the house through several generations. Next. One interesting fact about Berry Farm, Hillsdale, one of the many interesting facts, was that at least 47 women bought lots in Berry Farm between its inception in 1867 and 1871. They were a diverse group. Some were married and bought lots side by side with their husbands. Others were single women with children. Still others were young women who came to Berry Farm and built a new life. Next. This is Eliza Spotswood, and this photograph is in her older age, but she was in her late teens when she bought a lot on what's today Martin Luther King Avenue. Her father, according to family oral history, helped her buy the lot with the money he had earned as a cobbler while he was still enslaved. She built a house in which she lived with her mother. I don't know what happened with the father, but he was not there in the 1870 census. She later on married Reverend John Shippen in 1874, and they had not less than 12 children. Next. Berry Farm dwellings, which will be the subject of other presenters today, was built between 1941 and 1943 as housing for African Americans working in World War II effort. There was a lot of shortage of housing, so the federal government was taken by surprise that so many African Americans had come to Washington to work. So they had to quickly build housing for them. It was only later that it became public housing. It occupied only about 1/10 of the original land occupied by Berry Farm, Hillsdale. Next. The movement to desegregate the schools in Washington, D.C. was centered in Berry Farm, Hillsdale. Some of the plaintiffs in the case that determined the school's desegregation, Bowling versus Sharp, were residents of Berry Farm dwellings. That was the case of the two girls shown in this photograph with their parents, Adrienne and Barbara Jennings. Next. Unfortunately, Berry Farm Hillsdale was the victim of, among other ailments, overdevelopment. The first map shows Berry Farm Hillsdale in 1888, about 20 years after it was established. There are houses along the main routes and close to the streams that run in the neighborhood. The second map shows Berry Farm Hillsdale in 1988, about 120 years after its development. It's overcrowded with very few freestanding houses left, and unfortunately, with its sense of community fractured. It is divided by Suitland Parkway, which was built during the Second World War and divided the community in two. By then, Berry Farm Hillsdale had been subsumed into Anacostia, which had changed in the 1960s from an all-white neighborhood to a majority African-American neighborhood. Next. So this is the cover of the book that has been talked about. And if you want to learn more about this history, you can acquire a copy of it. I'll appreciate it. And thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alcione. I think I just want to ask one question before we move on to our next panelist, and that is this, did this happen anywhere else where the federal government purchased land for the express purpose of establishing a Black landowning community, and then, a community that then actually existed for a long time? Is there any other instance, and particularly in an urban area, but really anywhere that happened after the Civil War?
I don't believe so. I investigated, that, and I talked to Mr. Fly, who is a specialist on the subject, and he told me that he didn't, had not learned about, another case like this, that it was very unique.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have a really, really important history that happened here in DC. So thanks so much. And I will, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Amber Wiley, Amber Wiley. So Dr. Amber Wiley is an assistant professor of art history at Rutgers University. Her research interests center on the social aspects of design and how it affects urban communities, architecture as a literal and figural structure of power. She focuses on the ways that local and national bodies have made the claim for the dominating narrative and collective memory of cities, and examines how preservation and public history contribute to the creation and maintenance of the identity and sense of place of a city. Her publications cover African-American cultural heritage, urbanism in New Orleans, school design, urban renewal, and preservation. Amber received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University, a master's in architectural history and certificate in historic preservation from the University of Virginia School of Architecture, and a BA in architecture from Yale University. And Dr. Wiley joins us today as someone who gave expert testimony before DC's Historic Preservation Review Board in the July 2019 hearing to designate Berry Farm dwellings as a historic landmark.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Thank you, DC Preservation League and DC History Center for having us. Thank you, Alcione, for that great presentation. It reminded me of so many things that I had forgotten. And I learned something new, like you can always learn something new about Berry Farm Hillsdale. So I'll be talking about the case of integrity when looking at Berry Farm, and specifically the issues that I came up against when giving the testimony about integrity in front of the Historic Preservation Review Board 2 years ago now. So the first thing to note is that the Historic Preservation Office, the DC SHPO, did not actually support Empower DC and Prologue DC's nomination of Berry Farm to the DC Inventory of Historic Sites. In fact, they said that the Berry Farm dwellings, the public housing that existed upon the former Hillsdale community, did not contain significant integrity to convey, represent, and contain the values and qualities by which it was judged significant. So they said it does not have the integrity needed to preserve this space. Some of the things that they highlighted in their document of this particular, I won't even say a recommendation, a non-recommendation, was that they said that demolition was already underway and a raise application was pending for the Berry Farm dwelling. Keep in mind that demolition doesn't necessarily mean that the preservation battle is over. In many cases, it means the preservation battle has just begun. They said that there were alterations to the buildings, that the buildings were covered with stucco. Initially, they had concrete block walls that were covered with stucco, and that was an alteration. The roof line of in units of the buildings had been altered. Initially, they were flat, and later they were raised and turned into gable roofs. So that was something different. And the windows and the doors had been replaced. So keep this in mind. These were some of the alterations that they said made the buildings contain less integrity than they did previously. They said the buildings were in poor condition, which is true. The buildings have been abandoned. I won't say abandoned. The residents of Berry Farm had been pushed out of their homes. Many of them did not actually want to leave. And so the buildings had sat vacant for quite a while. And so they were in poor condition from that. They were also in poor condition from years of DCHA, the DC Housing Authority's lack of attention to the needs of the residents. And so when we came to the testimony, when we came and actually testified in front of the HPRB, some folks said, yeah, I was living there and they were in bad condition when I was living there, right? So what is that really saying about the public housing in the city? And finally, the kind of stickler for the DC SHPO is that they said there were no housing from the Reconstruction era remaining on site. And Alcione just told us, right, about the fractious family and what she believed to be the last remaining A-frame, right? So yeah, there's no housing, no structures from the Hillsdale era. And so these were some of the arguments that were put against the nomination proposal. So what my job was to come in and really look at the arguments that the SHPO was putting forward and thinking about ways, whether or not I agreed with that. And I disagreed strongly. So one of the things that I did was that I took the work that I had done with the National Park Service, National Historic Landmark Committee. I was on that committee for 4 years. We reviewed National Historic Landmark nominations and determined whether or not we would recommend that the Park Service actually approve the nominations that came across our table. And in the process of working with the National Historic Landmark Committee, we also thought about ways to update the National Historic Landmark nomination process to make it more accessible to a wider audience, in addition to thinking about the ways in which preservation criteria was developed in the first place, right? Like we're looking at this criteria, who created the criteria, what does it mean, so on and so forth. And so you see here on the top left, the old National Historic Landmark nomination preparation guide, which we worked on to update. It still hasn't been released yet. That was like 3 years ago. We'll see what happens. Crafting preservation criteria from John Sprinkle, which really gave this longer kind of history of the National Register and thinking about how and why we preserve certain buildings. And finally, I just went back to the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. What did the Secretary of the Interior recommend in terms of sites that were considered historic, right? So these are like the 3 main things I was looking at when I was reviewing the Berry Farm nomination. first and foremost, yes, the site was under the process of demolition, but it had been halted at the time that we were giving the testimony. And like I said earlier, demolition is usually like the start of the preservation battle. But keep in mind that the buildings that were being recommended for preservation, it wasn't the whole entire site, it was a segment of it. None of them had been demolished at the time that we went before the Historic Preservation Review Board. So all the buildings that were being recommended for nomination were still intact at that time. There was the issue of the roofs and the walls. So first is the walls, right? Concrete block walls that had been covered in stucco. And you actually see a little brick detail there, which I actually quite love. And the roofs, they said that the SHPO said the flat roofs, which were the modern aesthetic, were no longer there. And that was the most important modern thing. And so the buildings don't qualify. I want you to take note too in this image, you can see the Capitol Dome here and the Washington Monument here, which gives you a kind of idea, right? The Potomac, the Anacostia River is down here. So it gives you an idea of where the Berry Farm dwellings are in relationship to the rest of the city, or at least downtown DC. That topography still exists today. I went to visit the site back in 2019 in the middle of, well, actually a little bit before my testimony that I gave, and it was great that I could still see the Washington Monument. I don't know, I think the Capitol might be blocked by some of these newer office buildings going in, condos, but whatever, right? The major point of the topography was still extant, and you can understand that geography quite well. Alcione showed you these maps. And so one of the other arguments, or the counter arguments that I gave was, and this was supporting what the work that Sarah and Parisa had done earlier, is the fact that the streets that were part of the original Hillsdale settlement were still extant. Our buildings are not there, but the landscape is, right? And so this is to show you that those same streets, Sumner, Eaton, and Stevens and Wade, and even Howard Road way out here, they're the last remnants of that community that was there before. And even the place names emphasize that history of the Freedmen's Bureau and radical Republicans who were fighting for abolition, right? So that landscape still exists. The treescape, which was extremely important, these very mature trees that are, decades old, that were also kind of under the threat of demolition as well, right? The treescape remained, which was a really important part of the community. And so my counter argument against the SHPO was basically that instead of having no redeeming qualities, the site actually had 5 out of 7 of the qualities for integrity. Location, right? If you're thinking about it, if any landscape architect came into the site, they would say, yes, I can absolutely make these connections between this setting and the Reconstruction era setting. So the location was, none of the buildings had been moved. The setting, again, right, we're talking about the topography, the sight lines, the things that you can see and relate to, and seeing some of these earlier images, right? The images from the late 19th century all through the 20th century, right? The idea that you can still see the Washington Monument from the hill in Berry Farm. The design remains intact. And we're talking specifically about, and I'm going to come back, talking specifically about the layout of the buildings here, this courtyard design that was created in the mid 20th century as part of the public housing. The relationship of the buildings to each other and the courtyards. The materials, that was a point that I was willing to contend, as well as the workmanship. But remember, we weren't nominating Berry Farm under the architectural design. We were nominating for the social history. If this were a case of something that was an architectural nomination, materials and workmanship would be high on our list of priorities, but that's not what we were talking about. We're talking about this longer social history. Feeling and association. Historic preservationists don't like to deal with feeling and association because they don't have a kind of a technique or technological something that they can do in relationship to feelings and association. But these two were extremely important as the numbers of testimonies that came out from Berry Farm residents is that they felt strongly about the significance of that history, and they understood the history of their site, or they learned even through the process of trying to preserve their homes, the importance of the site. And it was one of those things that they wanted to keep as a part of DC history and not be erased from the face of the earth. I'm checking my time to make sure I'm not doing too much. So this is actually my final slide. And this is the 2025 DC Historic Preservation Office's Historic Preservation Plan, which is out and available for public comment, right? So you should check it out and see what they're talking about. And I'm just gonna say it, keep in mind, this is the same agency that did not support the nomination of Berry Farm to the local DC landmarks. Well, I was in there and I saw Berry Farm in the plan 10 times. I did a little word search and I was like, okay, yes, we're talking about it. And I saw Hillsdale in there once, right? And I think for me, what that signified is that the work that was done to preserve Berry Farm has kept the story of Berry Farm and kept it for the future, right? For future generations. And that's clear because the work that we did made sure that the Historic Preservation Office listened and has come back around to really support and, you know, accept this notion of the preservation of Berry Farm for the future. And I think the fact that Hillsdale was in there once also shows the fact that it was one of those communities that is kind of in the history book, so to speak, right? Hillsdale could be in there too, had Hillsdale been saved. And so I'm thinking about the fact that the work, you can see the impact of the work, but there's still much more to be done. And I think that's what Parisa is going to be talking about next. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, especially for walking us through the process by which you made the argument before the HPRB on the integrity of the site. Again, you know, it was in 2011 that that all of, I think, the public housing in DC was evaluated for whether it may be eligible for designation, and Berry Farm was one of many sites. In fact, I don't know if any of them actually were deemed eligible at that time. There are some other sites that I think probably are eligible, despite that, you know, that determination.
And I will say, Sarah, because I want to be clear, I think early in the presentation, there were some folks who were like, it's distressing that the site was not recognized. The nomination was successful, right? So the argument for the value and the integrity point is that some of the changes that were highlighted by the SHPO were actually reversible. So that's one of those things that the Secretary of the Interior says, if this is a change that can be reversed, then it's not going to impact the nomination as much. That's what they say, right? So it was a successful nomination despite the lack of integrity argument.
That's right, and we can talk about that more later. We did actually nominate many more buildings than were designated in the end, but we did get the designation. And also to reiterate Alcione's point that there are no buildings left representing the Reconstruction era community. So we also, you know, we're making the argument that this is because these buildings were built on land that was taken from that community. These are the buildings that we have to tell that story too. And then a couple other things I just wanted to quickly comment on. One is that there had been inquiry with the DC Historic Preservation Office much earlier on, before demolition started. And I believe that the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association and/or Empower DC was advised that it wouldn't be, you know, worth pursuing. So it wasn't that we just started this process, you know, at the moment that the raised permits were filed. And then I also want to give a shout out to Kim Williams at the Historic Preservation Office for her tremendous assistance in actually, you know, were going with me to the site, taking pictures and writing the architectural description for the nomination. So the staff of HBO, particularly Kim Williams, was quite helpful in this process. So I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our final panelist, Parisa Naruzi. So, okay, Parisa Naruzi has over 20 years of experience working with nonprofit organizations and organizing communities. After an early career as an organizer in the environmental movement, Parisa co-founded the citywide community organizing group Empower DC in 2003, an organization which works to build the confident self-advocacy and organized political power of low moderate income DC residents with a focus on fighting the displacement of residents amid DC's gentrification boom. At Empower DC, she has led the organization's Child Care for All campaign and the People's Property campaign, leading to victories that include winning funding for child care vouchers, which ended the city's waiting list for those services, and changing DC law to provide opportunity for public input into the quote surplus and disposition process for public property. Since 2001, Parisa has worked alongside the historic Ivy City community to record previously undocumented history through the Ivy City History Project. Parisa graduated with honors from Marlborough College in Vermont with a degree in environmental policy and interest group politics, and later completed a master's in community economic development from Southern New Hampshire University. And you're on.
Great. Thank you so much. Glad to be here with everybody. I want to say thank you to Amber and Alcione for your presentations, and to Sarah as well for all of the work that you've done, and some of that in collaboration with Empower DC. For those who don't know Empower DC, we, since 2003, we've been working citywide as an organization dedicated to community organizing, which is about building power to force change around racial, economic, and environmental justice. At our core, those are the issues that we are trying to affect the most. And, you know, Berry Farm is, for us, a sacred site of 150 plus years of struggle, Black-led struggle for housing and land. Just to give you a little bit of the storyline of how we got involved, we actually do a lot of work with public housing communities around the city. Our goal is to make sure that public housing residents have the tools and resources that they need to advocate for themselves and for their communities, to shape the future of their communities. And you may remember that the city passed a new policy called the New Communities Initiative back in 2004, and targeted several public housing properties, including Berry Farm, for complete redevelopment. If you just the title of the program itself, New Communities, it foretells the method that the city has pursued, which is essentially wiping these communities off the map, displacing everybody wholesale, removing people for a decade or more, and then bringing back some lucky people, perhaps. The track record of return has been really poor. So when we initially got a call from some Berry Farm residents, I think it was around in 2012, they were concerned about the redevelopment process that was taking place, and being, you know, some of the leadership there was saying that, you know, we're being asked to sign off on these things. We don't really have a full understanding of what they mean. We're not given the support to really understand, you know, these redevelopment documents and proposals that we're being asked to sign off on. And when we started working with residents, it was clear that residents of Berry Farm, one, felt very clearly that Berry Farm was historic. Many folks would say, oh, this is historic, they can't tear it down. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case, you know, that it was not protected from demolition. We did, as Sarah mentioned, have some early conversations years ago with some groups in town about trying to pursue a historic landmark designation. And we were told, this is not a good candidate, the buildings are not in good enough condition. And unfortunately, at that time, we didn't have the allies like Sarah and Amber and Alcione to make it happen. It didn't happen until later because of that. And that really foretells, again, the systemic barriers to lower income communities, Black communities in particular, being able to access these processes of historic preservation and other processes that I'll talk about. You know, these places are as worthy as any other place. These are monuments to our local community and culture. However, if we don't have the resources and the experts who are able to help us, you know, guide us through those processes, then we miss out on that chance. So that is unfortunately what was happening, and gratefully we were able to in the end preserve some buildings, as we'll talk a little bit more about. And, you know, the residents from the beginning, what they wanted was to renovate Berry Farm. They wanted to not be displaced. They loved the townhome style homes that they were living in, which afforded a front and backyard, you know, a good amount of green space. And unfortunately, the city refused to renovate. They also refused to build first, meaning that they would not allow there to be new development on the site and move people around the site. They refused to do that. Instead, they wanted to displace everybody, all residents of 444 units of housing, demolish the entire site, and then slowly rebuild, which takes oftentimes more than a decade to rebuild. And because the residents were trying to be heard and were being ignored, they did participate in another very closed, difficult process that the city has, which is the zoning process. So they went to the hearing at the zoning commission that was talking about the fate of their community. They tried to get what's called party status so that they could have a more significant role in that hearing, the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association, which is a tenant association on the property. And initially they were denied party status. They were literally told by the zoning commission, you are not uniquely impacted by this. Now, these are the residents who are being displaced, being told you are not uniquely impacted by this. And after some outrage, the zoning commission did reverse that decision. BFTAA, they did participate, but it was, again, another very difficult process that is dominated by developers and land use attorneys, and residents typically don't have the experts on their side to support them. And even for us at Empower DC, you know, a steep learning curve to do some of these things that we had not done before. So participating in the zoning hearings, presenting expert witnesses, all of this stuff, and then still having the zoning commission approve a development plan which would have displaced everybody, demolished everything, and failed to replace all of the public housing that was being destroyed. At that time, the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies Association got with attorney Aristotle Teresa, who is a Ward 8 resident, and his firm Stoop Law, and filed an appeal. And again, this is another very difficult process that if you do not have the right experts and resources in place, you cannot avail yourself of. But there was an appeal filed. The case had been approved in 2014. The appeal was filed in it was heard in 2016. A ruling did not come until 2018. So 4 years of this. Meanwhile, the residents were displaced. The courts actually ruled in favor of the tenants. They agreed. They said, you know what? Zoning Commission, you failed to address the displacement impact of this project. You failed to replace all of the public housing units, and we're remanding this, meaning we're sending this back to you to revisit it. By that time, unfortunately, the residents had been displaced. So part of the momentum that we used to work on this historic preservation nomination was the momentum of having tried everything to be heard, having tried everything to make sure that the community had a connective thread, that there was a fingerprint, that it was not being wiped off the map. And unfortunately, having basically the door slammed in the residents' faces at each of those turns. Most recently, the developers and the city, the Office of Planning, worked to change the city's comprehensive plan, which is the guiding document that sort of dictates how land can be developed. They changed what's called the future land use map for the property. And that now sets it up so the zoning can be changed, which means that the developers can build back Berry Farm without having hearings, without consulting with the community, avoiding what's called the PUD, the planned unit development process. Again, all of this stuff is very technical, and I'm sure some of the people on this meeting have experienced it, but most DC residents have not. And so when we're talking about how these land use decisions are being made, and if the most impacted people have not just a voice, but have power in those processes, we're really failing as a city. The good thing is that we continue to fight. We welcome you all to support that work through Empower DC. We continue to organize. Right now, we are working to make sure that residents have a guaranteed enforceable right to return to the property as it is rebuilt. You would not think it should be so difficult to make sure that people get to return to their home, but unfortunately it is. And we also have formed a very impressive committee of folks to work specifically on the future of the historic landmark. The Berry Farm Hillsdale Legacy Project is working to ensure that these preserved homes become a monument to this 150 plus year struggle for land and housing, that they really educate future residents about the individuals and the community as a whole that contributed so much to the city's culture. You know, everything from civil rights and welfare rights to school desegregation to go-go music, everything that Berry Farm embodies. And I have no doubt that as we work to make that real, to renovate those properties and make it the monument that it deserves to be, that it will become one of DC's most precious, most significant monuments to our own local history and culture. So I thank everybody and appreciate you again for being interested in this work. And I'll turn it back over to Sarah for questions, I think.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Parisa. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about sort of the process by which the process for sort of envisioning the future of the site, or a little bit more about, yeah, what is envisioned.
Well, we envision a space for education, a space where we have exhibits and information, a museum type space about the past, where we also have space for ongoing education that facilitates the ongoing struggle. So perhaps there's workshops and presentations and meeting space, an event space that all is structured around supporting the ongoing organizing for the future of the community as well. So we're really looking forward to making that possible. However, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion. Like I was part of the Cromell School historic designation back in 2002. And we're still fighting to get that school restored and used for its intended purpose that the community envisioned. And we did have a major win recently, but it still needs to be implemented. So again, this does not just happen. We have to organize and fight to make it happen.
Thank you. I think I'll in the interest of getting some of the audience questions answered, I will move forward with those now, and then if we have time, maybe I'll make some more remarks or ask you all some of my own questions. I guess there is one question in the chat that, well, we'll give Parisa another chance to talk to this later, but let me go back to Alcione. Alcione, can you speak to the resources that you used for your book?
Yes. Well, it was a variety of sources, beginning with the archives in the museum, which contain a lot of research that was done in the 1970s about the history of Anacostan, and by chance, the history of Berry Farm Hillsdale, although that was not the focus of it. There were many interviews of people that had lived in the community in the late 19th century. These people were in their 80s. And they remember, you know, they had lived it, the history, and they remember what had been told them about the neighborhood. I found materials in archives from the federal government. that map that you saw was from the Library of Congress. It was originally this very ugly yellowed map. And I sent it to Brazil to my nephew, who is a photographer, and told him, you turn this into a legible, nice map. And he did. And that's what you saw in my presentation. And let's see, Library of Congress, National Archives. There was a lot of legislative material that was published, because in the 1950s, the government tried to erase Berry Farm and redevelop it like they did with Southwest. When they couldn't do it with Berry Farm, they turned to Southwest. But the first choice was to just demolish everything in Berry Farm and redevelop it. So there was a lot of material there. So it was a variety of sources, you know, and there was a lot of material. I was able to compile, you know, a lot of information.
Thank you. And can you also speak to, there was another question about the history, about the name. Betsy Merritt wrote that Alcione mentioned that the original proposed name for the neighborhood was rejected. Well, the Hillsdale name was rejected.
No, actually.
Oh no, I'm sorry. The original proposed name Hillsborough was rejected, although the name of Hillsdale was later accepted.
Right, that's it. That's exactly what happened. And they also proposed Potomac City, and that name appeared in historic maps. I found at least 2 maps that had Potomac City there, but nothing stuck except you know, Berry Farm, because to this date, when you buy a house on the footprint of the original neighborhood, when you get your deed, you are going to, it's going to say that you bought a house in Berry Farm. And actually, I gave a presentation to a church in Anacostia, and that was one of the things that people were asking. I got the deed for my house, and they said, Berry Farm, why? And I explained, you know, because you bought a house on the footprint of the original settlement that was named Berry Farm. So because of all that complexity in the name, we decided to hyphenate it.
Right, and I should clarify that the because the question states, although you know that the name of Hillsdale was later accepted, it was never actually made official. The name of Hillsdale, it was never put on the maps. It was what the community members called the community, but Berry Farm is what forever remained on the maps and in the real estate records.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly that. And I participated in an event where people were talking about Hillsdale, and a resident said, "What are you talking about?" You know, when people ask me where I live, I say Berry Farm. So, you know, the Berry Farm is the historic name, but there is a section of the community today that wants to rename it Hillsdale. So, you know, we have to acknowledge that, but we can't take Berry Farm out of the name because that's the historic name.
Right, right. Thanks. Yeah, I think that I mean, that's a conversation maybe that could be had about so many names in DC of places that are named for people that you know, were enslavers. But the names stuck, you know, the names that were given to these schools and these streets, and they have become identified with communities that, you know, feel very close to those, you know, that embrace those names still. So this question of whether to change the name is a big one, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to hop in
Yeah.
here for just a second with a little anecdote that my grandfather always told me about that Berry Farm history, and that it was owned by, you know, a plantation owner and all these things. And I couldn't understand the chronology. Like, he would tell me things and I would be like, but it's public housing. He was like, yeah, but and I couldn't understand what was happening in between there. I didn't know the Hillsdale history. Even though that's what he was telling me too. He told me the Hillsdale history. And so I think it's really important to recognize these different names as the community changed too, so that the story could be told, because it's complex and it could be very confusing. And I think even in some of the questions where, you know, someone was like, well, how many people still own their homes in Berry Farm? And it's like, but they don't, because they were displaced by the public housing, right? So like all the things that folks are saying today, I think that the attention to detail, like Alcione is pointing out, the need to recognize that is really important so the story gets told properly and so that we can really understand what happened here on this site.
Thank you, Amber. So let's see. Another question we have here is how much of the original Berry Farm housing project was saved, and will it be renovated, and who owns this? Parisa, would you like to speak to this question?
Sure. And Sarah, correct me if I misstate anything, but I believe it's 5 buildings,
Yeah.
which is five sections. Sarah, is that right? Is it 5 sections?
It's 5 multi-unit buildings.
5 multi-unit buildings.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we can pull up the map of where it is, but it is owned by the DC Housing Authority. They do have a lead developer of the project who's managing the project of renovation or rebuilding of the whole site. Will it be renovated? That does seem to be what they're saying. However, when and how and for what purpose all remains part of the argument. I think that they have indicated that they may use a portion of it for some type of museum archive kind of space, but that they would want to use some of it for private housing, which is not the vision that we share. We believe that the entire site is a public treasure and should not be private housing, but should be again used for these educational purposes to uplift the ongoing struggle for land and housing in the city. And I think Sarah's got, this is a great story map that you can find online. And the area circled in red is the area that has been preserved. So that set of 5 rows there, which includes the homes of some of the significant people that we highlighted in the nomination.
And I can, when I get them, I can try to share. This is a story map that was produced by the Historic Preservation Office based on research that was done for the nomination, and another article that's published online via the DC Policy Center. That's I really recommend looking at, and just an example sort of the work that the Historic Preservation Office has been doing around making DC's civil rights history more visible. They produced this story map about Berry Farm, as well as another one on the civil rights history of the Kingman Park neighborhood, among other projects that they've been involved with over the last couple of years. Let me see. Let me go to another question here. Were the 1941 owners compensated when the public housing was built? Alcione.
Yes, they were compensated, but of course, in every case with eminent domain, the money they got was not enough to rebuild what they had. There was a family that had been there from the very beginning, I mean, generation after generation. And the lady was already in her, 70s or 80s. So you can imagine, the absolute distress of these people that were displaced, to build Berry Farm dwellings. But the distress that was caused by building Suitland Parkway was even bigger, because that was hundreds of houses and hundreds of people that were displaced. So
is there anybody else that wanted to speak to this question? I just got a note in the Q&A that no, okay. And another question we have is whether there is any threat to Langston Terrace public housing currently. I know that's a historically designated site. The question states, is there any threat to Langston Terrace public housing being razed? I think the buildings are brick and so well made. I went to Spingarn and that building is closed, so I was just wondering. And I don't know if Amber or maybe Parisa can speak to either of these questions.
I was actually
Or I
trying
can
to
try
look it
to.
up. Right. I was like, is anything going to happen in Langston Terrace? So Langston Terrace is one of those public housing developments that architectural historians go to tour because it was designed by Hilliard Robinson. Right. So it's on the National Register. I know that the DC Housing Authority is going through all this renovation. It seems that they did some renovation at Langston Terrace. I do not see any articles that talked about immediate threat, but in terms of like, if there were a hierarchy of public housing projects in DC, specifically related to like design or historic preservation, Langston Terrace would be at the top. And I think that even if that particular complex were threatened, that you would see people coming out of the woodwork, and you would see them coming out of the woodwork because of the design and because of who designed it. And so that's what I'll say on that, but I don't know if there's any other information that folks could share.
Parisa, do you know? Can't find you here. I think my understanding is Langston Terrace is currently on the list. I know it's currently on the list for renovation of some sort, privatization, right? So there's a whole, well, I mean, that's not what it's being called. It's called, I can't remember what the terminology that's being used, but there's a lot of, partnership now with private developers to renovate these sites and reorganize how they're managed, right? So I don't think that Langston Terrace architecturally is under threat, but I think that its status as public housing may be under threat. And Parisa could maybe speak to that a little more clearly than I can.
I can just, oh, maybe she's back. She did get
Okay.
kicked. I think she got kicked out. Okay, she's back.
Oh, okay. Parisa, if you didn't hear me, we were just speaking to whether Langston Terrace is in any way threatened. We know it's a historically designated site, and we think that it's probably, because it's very significant in terms of the architect and its architecture is very significant, that it's probably not architecturally threatened, but that its status as public housing may be.
Yeah, that's definitely something we need to do a little more investigating of. My understanding is that portions of the property are designated or aspects of the property. So we need to just double check the extent of the designation. And yeah, yes, my understanding is that it is being targeted probably for what's called RAD, which is a privatization of the property. So yes, let's be vigilant about preserving all public housing in the city. We need all of it.
Thank you for clarifying that. And sorry, I'm trying to scroll through both the Q&A and the chat here. Another question we've got is, when did the land at, so this is going back to the the Reconstruction era community. When did the land at Berry Farm first go up for sale? I could only find tax records dating back to 1872. This question is from Alice Harris.
I can answer it. 1867. The lots start being sold in July of 1867. And I showed in the presentation the first receipt for, the down payment for the first lot that was sold. And I'm not sure why it's not recorded, but they started being sold in 1867.
And I think that you actually have a list, Alcione, right, of all of the very original landowners that was published by the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yes, it was compiled for all the owners between 1867 and 1871, which were the very first ones that bought land. It
Okay.
was compiled by the museum, the Anacostia Community Museum, in the 1970s. And yes, I do have that list.
I hope that we, one of the goals of this, the committee that's sort of envisioning the future of the site is to use that list and other documentation to start researching. And I know that you've started this too, to research some of the descendants of this community and you know, sort of make sure that people are aware, people that are descended from people that lived at Berry Farm are aware of this history.
Yeah.
You know, because they may want to be engaged in this process.
Yeah, I was able to interview the great-grandson of Mr. Fractious that I mentioned in the presentation. But unfortunately, he has passed away already. But, you know, I'm sure there are other members of that family, but he was the one that I was able to talk to.
And somebody asked specifically, how can I find information on the occupants of Douglas Hall in the early 1900s?
You have to look at in the census, you know, because of the address. It will be Nichols Avenue. Douglas Hall was on Nichols Avenue and corner of Howard Road. So this, what was the date that person asked?
In the early 1900s.
Yes, exactly, 1900 census. Just go to the 1900 census, look for, you know, I don't think that Douglas Hall is going to appear in the census, but the street address is going to be there.
Let's see, and then moving much further forward, from Patricia Tyson, we have a question: is there a listing of some families that lived there in the 1950s?
Again, the census is coming up, 1950s.
Right.
Anxious waiting for it.
Yeah.
That will be the place to go, you know, and look for, because the streets are very clearly, you know, marked. You know, they talk about Howard Road, and then they have, you know, the numbers and the people that live there, and that way you can find there are no lists. There is the DC, what is it, that published all the addresses, all the residents and all the addresses. What you call
The
it?
city directory?
The city directory, yes. In that sense, you can go by the streets, 1950, and by the streets in the neighborhood and find, you know, who are the people that were living there.
Right. Something else that occurred to me is the petition. There's a petition that you shared with me, Alcione, of all of the people, many of the people who were engaged in the fight to desegregate the schools signed a petition, and most of them, maybe all of them, were residents of Berry Farm dwellings. This is in the 1950s.
Exactly.
And their addresses, you know, their names and addresses are listed on this petition.
Right, exactly.
There's about 300 of them or so.
Yeah, there were a lot of people signing, and most of them were living on Berry Farm dwellings. You were absolutely right.
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned in the presentation, the fight for the school desegregations was centered in Berry Farm, Hillsdale, and particularly in Berry Farm dwellings.
Yeah.
I wanted to add on to that point. It was a thing that I actually took out of my presentation, is the fact that one of the things that the SHPO had said in terms of the school desegregation issue, they said, well, we already have a landmark for Bowling v. Sharp, right? We have Sousa Junior High, Sousa Middle School. And one thing I'd like to point out, and because this is part of the research that I'm doing right now, is that the plaintiffs in that case didn't go to Sousa, right? That case went through the court system for 4 years and was decided in 1954. So Spotswood Bowling went to Shaw, and then he went to Spingarn, right? You know, so it's funny to me that we're also acknowledging the school that they didn't get to go into. Yes, it was the attempt to desegregate Sousa, but they didn't go to Sousa. folks lived in Berry Farm though, you know, and so I think that it's an interesting way that we think about even preservation, right? Sousa was the start of the case, but it wasn't central to these folks' lives. So it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, like why we would landmark, say, Sousa versus actually landmarking Berry Farm and the people who did the work.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%. They went to the door and they were not received.
I'm just going to, oh, I was going to try to show a slide of where some of these people lived actually that we used in the nomination. So let me just quickly share my screen again. So this is one of the slides from our presentation before the Historic Preservation Review Board, showing where some of these plaintiffs lived. And the buildings that were actually designated in the end over here do include the home of the Jennings sisters, Barbara and Adrienne Jennings, who were you know, in elementary school when their parents first moved to Berry Farm. But they became plaintiffs, you know, when it was time for them to go to junior high school, and there was no junior high school for them to go to on this side of the Anacostia River. Oh, well, there may have been one over in Deanwood, but there was nothing anywhere near where they were. So the Jennings sisters, and you can see where the Spotswood Bowling lived very, not within Berry Farm dwellings, but just outside of the footprint of the public housing. And then if I can just, because we didn't really discuss this as, you know, this is a very significant part of the nomination, was that, you know, Berry Farm was also home to this really significant group of organizers for tenants' rights, and who include the founder, you know, a co-founder of the National Welfare Rights Organization, Etta Horn. So her home is indeed one of the buildings that's actually designated now. And I can try to stop sharing now. Let's see what other questions we have here. Parisa, what kind of community engagement efforts will be part of the vision for the future of the site?
Well, we'll be doing events. We'll be doing, we do have a list of Berry Farm residents that we try to remain in contact with on a regular basis. So that will be one of our most central groups of people that we'll be consulting with. But then we would like to, of course, consult with the surrounding community as well as citywide. But I think it's important to put the residents' voices, you know, first and foremost. So we'll be doing different meetings and events, and you know, we expect ultimately to do a design plan that represents, you know, the visual drawings, and we probably will have to raise money. We'll definitely have to convince the people in power that they should embrace this vision and work with us as partners rather than make us fight them for the next 10 years about it, which unfortunately has been, you know, our experience with other, you know, I mentioned Cromell School, which was designated, and the community had to fight, 20 years since the designation to get the city to finance the renovation. So, you know, there's politics involved, you know, how will we make this a priority? So yes, the vision is a big part of it. We'll be engaging people in shaping that, but also the work around advocating for it and making it a priority to implement. And that is going to take a lot of voices.
I do want to mention that on the note about fundraising that we did, we've been applying for grants to pursue this work, and we did receive a first grant yesterday from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to start this work. So very excited. That was very exciting news. And I don't know, we've also, well, I'll stop there for now. Let's see.
Just to say, Sarah,
Yeah.
that on that grant, the focus of that grant will be doing a very small film to talk about why the site is so historic and important and sacred to us, and the vision for that. And we're also working on a website and some, other materials to share. And once those are all available, we'll definitely share them with everybody, and hope you'll share them with others as well.
So I wanted to pop in and say, I didn't even see this before, but there are 2 people who have their hands raised. I don't know if you see that, Sarah.
Sorry.
I just went to the chat or participants, and it was like, oh, yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
Well, now there are 3 people. Okay.
Okay. So are these people that would like to ask questions live? I'm not sure how that even works.
Yeah, I think we have, well, I know Jacqueline told me hers was a error, don't lower her hand. But Evelyn, if you have, I mean, if it's okay with everybody, I can, oh, never mind, her hand is now lowered. Okay.
Okay.
Never mind. Well, if anybody has questions, again, type them in.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm
good.
kind of like jumping around, we're like jumping around with the history and the topics here because the questions are just, I'm trying to just address them as they come in.
Yeah, you're doing great, sir.
So,
You're doing great.
oh, okay, so here's one. Well, okay. Yeah, I might not get to all of them either. Do the panelists support creating historic districts for other historic Black communities throughout the city, or might there be a better way to preserve historically Black communities in the city other than designation?
There are better ways. Well, there, yeah. So Leroy Park, it's a family neighborhood, right? My family was in Leroy Park since the 1950s, and that was designated a historic district, right? But the historic district designation, which was in the 70s, did not, you all know Leroy Park is highly gentrified. So historic preservation can't be the be all end all. And I don't think anybody on the panel imagines that that's the case. I think there has to be more strident attempts in the city government to help people stay in their homes, right? If that's, once upon a time, there was a first home buyers initiative or something like that allowed people to have tax write-offs or credits for buying a home. Well, like, can we have tax credits for staying in the home? Can we, what can people do? What can the city do to help people maintain the places where they live, right? And so I think that's really the question, even more so than just creating historic districts. So I imagine that Parisa has some strong thoughts about that as well. So don't mean to throw you under the bus.
Well, we care about who gets to use the buildings, who gets to use the land. I mentioned that we're in this battle right now around a guaranteed right to return for Berry Farm residents. And we've been told, oh, the zoning commission, that's outside of their purview. They just deal with land use. And who gets to use the land is part of land use, right? So I think we need a reimagining of all of these systems. And, one thing that happened through the comprehensive plan was a big conversation about how a racial equity lens now needs to be applied to how we do all of these things, each piece of it: historic preservation, planning, zoning, design review, development review, all of these things. Yet we have not yet defined as a city, what is that going to look like? And it has to include, of course, first of all, foremost, the most impacted Black and Brown communities at the forefront of decision-making and shaping what's happening, but also making sure that people get to stay. I'm not interested in preserving buildings just for a building, for a facade. No, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in preserving it as a component of community, as a place of uplift, as a place that community members can continue to share with future generations their history, have a sense of pride, have a sense of purpose. And that's why we fought so hard for Cromell School again to be turned into a community center that uplifts people and not, just a piece of land full of high-end condos, because that is not in keeping with the legacy of this site and the reason why it is special. It's not just its design and its bricks, you know, it's because a Black community fought for it in 1911 to be built, and a Black community saw it as its heart for so many generations, and it should continue to serve that Black community. So yeah, I mean, I think historic preservation is one tool, but all of these tools need to be reimagined. I see the question from Jacqueline Carmichael about how the Office of Racial Equity is assisting. There is a new, because of legislation that was passed last year called the REACH Act, there is a new, two new agencies in the city, the Office on Racial Equity, which is under the mayor's office, and the Council Office on Racial Equity, which works within the council and reviews legislation through a racial equity lens. We are in communication with both of those agencies. The Office on Racial Equity is the body that is to help with the implementation of this racial equity lens, this new policy in the comp plan. The reality is, though, that, you know, not only did we have to fight for that language to be in the comprehensive plan, we have to fight now for it to be implemented and not ignored. So we are actually having those meetings and conversations now.
Thank you, Parisa. Let me ask a couple little smaller questions about some of the this one specific question is about whether that I think Alcione can answer are either of the Jennings sisters. This is still alive. These are the sisters that were plaintiffs in Bowling v. Sharp.
No, I don't think so. I think they both have passed away.
And then another question, I think, for you, Alcione, is was there a cemetery unique to Berry Farm, or did the community use St. Elizabeth's Hospital? Or yeah, was there a cemetery unique to Berry Farm?
No, there were cemeteries in Berry Farm, at least two that I can remember of, Hillsdale Cemetery and Macedonia Baptist Church Cemetery. And if you allow me to tell the story of the Macedonian Cemetery, it's very sad. The church and the cemetery were displaced by the Suitland Parkway. And the cemetery was not all removed. Half of it was removed. And the other half that is in the slope that goes down from, Elvins Road, where Elvins Road ends, and goes down into the Suitland Parkway. Those graves are still there. When I was writing the book, I tried to find the graves, but I had no money, so it was just somebody poking around to see if they could find anything. But I definitely know that there are graves there because there is a document by the government saying we are not going to remove all the graves, and we are going to plant up the slope, so pretty soon the cemetery is going to disappear. So it's a very sad story.
Thanks. Yeah, this is the case with a lot of historic Black cemeteries. I mean, all over the country, but and also here in DC. And there is being work done around some of these to bring, greater visibility to these sites. And I want to ask because I think we need to get ready to wrap up here. But so to combine two questions into one. Parisa, what is your vision for the, let me just ask the question, what can people do to advocate, for the future of Berry Farm? I think, what is the question? How can DC residents help advocate for Berry Farm residents at this point? And then the other question we have is, what is your vision for the future of DC to prevent demolitions, displacements, and evictions like we saw in Berry Farm?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to prevent displacement is to not, demolish people's homes when they have no other place to go. So build first, either renovating or building first is the solution. And the city knows that, they just haven't done it. So it's actually a core principle of the New Communities Initiative to try to build first. On the 25-acre site like Berry Farm, they could have easily built in phases and moved people around, and they refused to do it. So I think that's one of the biggest solutions to preventing displacement. And you know what people need to do: join an organization, support an organization that is in this fight. Empower DC, of course, is working with Berry Farm residents. There's other organizations that are working with other communities around the city. And every turn, everywhere you go, if there's an elected official speaking, ask them what's going on with Berry Farm. You know, how are you making sure that people are returning? You'll hear a lot of propaganda, in my opinion, from the mayor's office about how great she's doing with affordable housing. And the reality is that does not include public housing. That does not include housing for our lowest income residents. So you always need to ask, housing for who? Affordable to who? Is it affordable to very low income people? Yeah, just constantly ask, when are, you know, are you making sure that all the Berry Farm residents are returning?
Thank you. And I think we're at 1:28, so I'm gonna turn over the last 2 minutes back to Melissa, or to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists today for, taking the time to speak to our audience, whether they know